All right, everyone. We'd like to welcome Lauren Burrows. Did I say that right?
Yeah, you got it right.
She spent the last 7 years within the international development community, evolving her skills in monitoring, evaluation, and learning. She currently freelances for several different organizations and has begun her journey to understand what organizational transformation does and could look like with her podcast partner, Teia. Um, Welcome to the show, Lauren.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to
Yeah,
be here.
absolutely. No, we are. I in particular, like I work in international development, so I'm very like interested in this topic and like learning more about your background. So I think that the best thing to do is, walk us through your career and let us know a little bit more about you.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when you're in the monitoring and evaluation space, you can talk about it forever. So I'll try not to go on for too long. So I started my career in M&E, 8 years or so ago in South Sudan, actually. And I think I never kind of intentionally was like, oh, I'm going to go into monitoring and evaluation. Like, this is definitely what I want to do. I kind of fell into it a little bit. And it was really starting in that kind of research space. So I started as an intern for a research consultancy. And I think back then people were less like, oh, a white person in South Sudan, what's that about? But so I just rocked into Juba, just being like, okay, what's this about? And not even really knowing what to expect. And I mean, when you're younger, you just kind of dive in, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
I worked for this consultancy and moved around South Sudan. I had, such a privileged time being in communities that, rarely get visited and kind of really understanding a context in a really deep way. And I think that kind of got me into the M&E space or monitoring and evaluation space. And from then I went to Sudan where I did some additional kind of research with the same company. And then I moved into a program officer, but there's a lot of monitoring and evaluation in it for a mine action company or mine action organization. And that was in Afghanistan. So I think by the time I'd started, I'd kind of got this all, working in conflict zones, kind of being at the edge of the humanitarian space, if you like. And then spent a couple of years there, building up to kind of a monitoring and evaluation manager. And then just going from there to another organization to work in a more kind of data-centric space. And then entering into the consultancy world. And that was also a bit of an accident, to be honest. I'm not sharing too many key directions here. But I think with COVID-19, there was a space where a lot of people were like, okay, so what do we do now? We like this working from home. We want a bit more autonomy in a sector that feels a bit disillusioned. So the consultancy space kind of gives you that freedom. So then also challenging people's perceptions of monitoring and evaluation, as an individual, I think is a really kind of fun space to be in. So that's kind of where I am now. And I suppose then my journey has just kind of been hopping around a lot and really learning about deeply monitoring and evaluation in context, and particularly like conflict settings, and working with that space that's evolved. Like M&E used to be so quantitative centric. It was all about the log frames and the indicators, and it always felt like you needed to have a very technical sort of mindset. But more recently, it's become more qualitative, and that kind of suits me a bit better, to be honest. So I've enjoyed kind of seeing that transition. And then as part of that, this kind of data science thing has started to come into the space a bit. Like, how do you meet data science in the space where you're measuring things and you're monitoring what works? So that was always a bit of an ambition, but, I'll be the first to admit the quantitative space is not my go-to. Math, I was terrible at school. Um, that's been a little bit my journey, really, and just picking up and meeting amazing people along the way. So yeah.
Well, that's great. I mean, that's really interesting to, travel around and get to understand all these different cultures and this different information. And I'm really interested in like monitoring and evaluation, because is it what it sounds like? Is it, you talked a little bit about it, like the qualitative and the quantitative being more aimed at, information and ones and zeros, and qualitative being more about like what is actually like what is the emotional and impact about all these things. So I guess if you could dig into a little bit
Yeah.
of that, that would be great to like understand that more.
Yeah, and I think you kind of made me think a bit like sometimes when people ask what is monitoring and evaluation, you kind of cover it with this, I'm measuring impact. My job is about impact. Isn't that amazing? When in reality, you're kind of just working with Excel spreadsheets. You're kind of just putting frameworks together and putting numbers to
Right.
measure indicators. And, it's not always that kind of really exciting. So, what have we found? And actually, I'd say that what have we found? What is your impact? Is still kind of that very far question that people are always chasing. People always expect, in monitoring and evaluation, you're going to have that beautiful golden nugget that someone's like, yes, that's it. But in actual fact, that's a bit of a misdemeanor. Like we're always chasing that and we're always chasing lessons. So, I've come to learn that maybe we shouldn't necessarily be totally focused on the impact, but rather how you learn along the way. And I think that's where the Excel spreadsheets come in, unfortunately. And
Yeah.
obviously the data collection side along that. And I think a lot of people in monitoring and evaluation are struggling with that space of, I want to talk to people. I want to hear the stories. I want to understand how people are affected by a particular program. But what COVID-19 has shown us, that maybe it shouldn't be me doing that. It's actually technical expertise in these countries that I was in before, and they're the ones that actually have the nuance, the understanding to tell us what is and isn't working. And so maybe the monitoring and evaluation role is more about how do you facilitate and guide that learning from the people in the context that are already there. So I think that's something I've sort of learned along the way too. But yeah, going back to log frames, I mean, when will they die? I mean, we've all like sat there with thousands of like numbers in a table and been like, how has somebody calculated this? Or, someone who's left did something 5 years ago and you end up with a framework and you're like, oh, I don't even know. So there were
So
many times.
a log framework is like a giant Excel sheet, like
But
like just where all the data is like not
exactly.
well, yeah, right. It's not been codified or like what's the try organized. It's just there, right?
Well, I mean, it's organized to an extent. So I guess you'll have your indicators like, number of people reached, for example, number of men and women
Right.
reached. And then, you might have sort of columns that say how you're going to do that, how you're going to collect that data, and then your target number, and then what you've achieved maybe annually, for example. But that's the thing,
Gotcha.
it's very much just an Excel that says you've reached 1,000 people, but, so what? Like, you've reached 1,000 people to what end? And I think that's the more interesting bit about monitoring evaluation and creating the space to say, well, why? Why was that the case? And that's where other frameworks were born out, like the theory of change. I don't know how much you love the theory of change or not, but it's this, it's another sort of arrows and tables diagram and a narrative around how people think you get to that impact from your own place as an organization or your activities. Um, and so, yes, it's the log frames and the Excel sheets, but it's sort of also expanding into that more interesting, how did we actually get there and why? Um,
Right.
so that bit, I guess, is the more interesting bit. I mean, I think a lot of us would love to just sit there and analyze and do that kind of more in-depth stuff. But, as we all know, donors have an accountability factor that means we also have to present numbers. So I think monitoring and evaluation as a career and as a space is like finding that balance between the numbers, the quantitative, we reach this many people, but then also asking why and digging deeper into those spaces. It sounds quite fun, doesn't it? But it's not always.
Well, it sounds quite interesting at the very least, and I'm really interested in, and I was going to go in this later, but we'll just go do
Yeah,
it now. Is you
sure.
talk about on your LinkedIn about the feminist approach to this,
Yeah,
like to this information, and having worked in this space, I know that donors, and you've alluded to this already, that donors have a lot of influence on us. USAID for the American companies have a lot of influence on us. So, like when you're in this space, how do you advocate for this lens of a feminist approach, or like try to work towards that?
yeah, it's a great question. And I think that kind of reminds me that not only as a monitoring and evaluation specialist or technical advisor or whatever? Are you collecting numbers and understanding impact, but you're always advocating for that? I mean, there were many times when I found myself in organizations and I had to be a kind of internal champion for monitoring and evaluation, and an internal champion for the effectiveness of what I was doing and why it was useful and why people needed it. So yeah, I was always sort of on an internal campaign, if you like. And so to kind of build on that, there's a deeper reflection now around sort of the power and positionality in monitoring and evaluation. And that's where the feminist side comes in. And what that means is really assessing what impact your micro decisions have. So, for example, if I'm deciding that we're going to measure number of women in a particular context that we've reached, I'm excluding others from that indicator. So actually that information is not going to be gathered. And therefore I'm framing the entire narrative around what our impact will look like. So that's quite a big decision. And so I think reflecting on these decisions is where that kind of understanding of power comes in. Who's the decision maker and why are we making that decision? So for another example, maybe, number of people who perceive they're safer. I'm choosing this idea of people feeling safer rather than feeling something else. So why have I chosen feeling safer and not, asked the communities how they would measure their own change in that particular context? And I'm obviously coming at that from a white person in London. So I've got my own biases and assumptions around how they think change happens. So I think there's a real acknowledgement needed as we move through monitoring and evaluation as to how we document those decisions and how we give reasoning as to why we made that decision. Because ultimately we're just framing the sector for what we perceive the impact is going to be. So I think that alludes a bit to what I mean in the feminist area. And then to advocate for that is quite difficult because it's then you're advocating for more space to understand those decisions. And as you know, everyone in the sector is, burnt out, tired, too busy, doesn't have time for that. So always you're advocating for the space to have those deeper discussions. And that's a challenge. We're all kind of compounded with things we need to be looking at. I see now, conflict analysis, power analysis, gender analysis, all these things we need to understand. And they're very, very important. But, it all is a lot to do in the capacity and resources that any organisation has. And I think some donors are moving in this direction, especially ones like Canada, for example, that have feminist policies, or in Europe that are already kind of that way inclined. But some other donors have political interests and they'll always be more familiar with the log frame or with other things that suits their needs as a donor. So there is a huge advocacy piece in that. And, I haven't quite got it right all the time, but yeah, it's a challenge.
Has that affected your career? Has that affected your career in a way of how you've decided to go from one organization to another, or even this move into consultancy? How has that affected you?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I maybe alluded to it earlier that having this space to challenge organizations is really important to me. And so moving through the organizations has been kind of looking for a way to create that space for myself and also to kind of demonstrate my values as I move through that space. And I think, sometimes monitoring and evaluation is tied to organizational and donor interests that might contradict with your own values. So then how do you create space to put forward what that means to you? And so definitely that was a driver. And I think to a large extent, and maybe this is a more personal reflection, I was always chasing being better with something, with a weak area, I guess is what I mean. So as I said before, the math quantitative piece wasn't quite my area of thought, and the data science. So as I moved through my career, I always tried to choose an organization where I could pick up on the area that I was weakest in. That sounds really strategic, doesn't it? It didn't always work out like that.
Yeah.
But I did try that, and I don't know if it's because I had this sort of obsession with, being the best at monitoring and evaluation and making a name for myself in that space, which isn't always a great thing to think. But that was definitely where I wanted to go. And then I think in my head, I was like, I want to get into data science now. So I moved to an organization that was more quantitative and had more data science pieces with it. But then, COVID-19 hit and all sorts of other things changed. So then I had to kind of reevaluate a bit my career and say, well, how else can I, chase what's important? And maybe it's not just the technical pieces. Maybe it's actually my values and morals that are equally as important. And so I think COVID-19 in a way gave me the space to jump into that consultancy space because the opportunity arose. I do some consultancy with my podcast partner and she was up for it too. So it was sort of like, okay, we've got something here between us, let's give it a go. And also, the consultancy space, I think, has, problems with like who's in it, how many people are in it, what technical thought is in that space. So how can we balance that with a more value, feminist-driven approach to consultancy as well? So yeah, that's where I am.
Yeah. Well, you bring up an interesting idea because, and my partner, she once said, she really values the idea that like when you're at a job, if you can like fight through the idea that like I don't like this work, but I'm still gonna do it well, is really important. And I was wondering, you just said you pursued all of these careers or pursued this career jumping so you could be challenged in areas that you are, let's not say bad at, you're weak at. And I know that for me, when I'm trying to do something that I don't like, it's super hard. And has nothing to do with like the M&E or anything like, but I was just wondering how did you overcome those obstacles to like really, better yourself in those areas?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think sometimes, there is kind of a realization, I think, as you're younger and you're growing in your career, that there's always going to be things you don't like. And so,
right.
How much you become tolerant of that and you try and focus on areas you do like and you try and kind of manage your space better. And so I do think like when I was younger, there was a part of me that was like, oh, I don't like this, therefore I'm out. And that's hugely privileged, right? Like that's kind of insane. And so, and I'm I'm admitting this, but as I'm reflecting on it. And so I think as I've gone through it, as I've like advanced in my career, I have come to assess that balance a bit better and to kind of find pockets of things that I enjoy more that balance it out. And I think, yeah, you're right. The quantitative thing, I was always like, oh, I don't really like this. But I think I kind of evolved my thinking to, oh, I don't like this, but is there something here I can learn about that can make it easier or someone? And I think the internet was really helpful for me in that way because, there's YouTube videos on everything nowadays. And, getting a book here or whatever. And so really looking for that information and, being critical about what I'm finding, but trying to build up spaces where there are linkages. And there are some books now around like how, qualitative data meets quantitative in a much kind of softer frame. So, that was really helpful to discover those things. But yeah, I think it's a really, really great point and a challenge. And yeah, I think I might still be on that journey.
I hope we all are, because there's never the one thing that doesn't bug you about any job that you have.
Yeah, right.
But so I guess my question is like, what advice would you give to people who are getting into this field? Like you said that, you're much later in your career. So what would you, if you're earlier in your career, if you could do it all again, like also taking into perspective of, our new reality, you've alluded to COVID a lot and, the new reality that we're all living in. So like, what advice would you give people getting into this field?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, gosh, if I could do it all again, it's a big one. Yeah, I think what I didn't do so much was, I kind of blindly went into it a little bit and was like, this space feels like something where I'm giving back rather than, and that's a great thing to, as a young person going into a career, but reaching out to networks that already exist and understanding the dynamics of what's working, not working. So I think, for example, in London, there are like learning networks on international development, and I belong to this learning network, and it's just a group of development professionals. I've never met them, but we have a WhatsApp group, and if people ask questions, they throw it in. And it's just kind of cool because they're all in different parts, and some of us try and answer those questions, when we can or how we can. And I've learned a lot about that other people have similar challenges, or that other people are, looking to get into the career or change their jobs and so on. And everyone is incredibly helpful. So I think that there used to be barriers around, an exclusivity in the sector and an exclusivity about monitoring and evaluation and the expertise. But now I'm seeing, and as these groups open up, like, let's share the challenges, let's tell people the realities of what it's like to work in this sector. And so I think I should have and would now lean more into understanding what it actually is like in reality, um, and understanding the complexity of some of the contexts that people work in. So that's definitely something I'd advise somebody doing. See what networks are out there, connect with people on LinkedIn. I shamefully connect with people on LinkedIn and I'm like, hi, how's it going? I'm in this sector doing this. Like, do you want to chat about this? And, I
Right.
think people are willing to talk and share. And so, I just advocate for that hugely. And I think people back when I started monitoring and evaluation, they saw it as a very kind of technical field. Like, you have to have a certain set of skills to get into this. And again, that kind of exclusivity, but that's not the case. Like, don't be, fooled by a terms of reference that says you have to have 5 years experience and you have to be very good at stata. That's a bit exclusive. Like, you can learn it. Like, maybe you'll bring a different perspective or something else that they need more than they realized. And I
Right.
think you've got to go into it with that confidence, because we're all sitting in this echo chamber of like reinforcing our own thoughts about, where we are and who we are in this sector. And so to inject some new thinking, I think is really important. So, my advice would be also don't be fooled by what's written in a job terms of reference. I hired someone who I remember a couple of years ago, and I'm sure she wouldn't mind me saying this, but she was in the volleyball space, had no monitoring and evaluation background, had some interesting connections elsewhere, like kind of loosely. But the way she'd written her cover letter and CV was really clever, the way she tried to connect volleyball to monitoring and evaluation. And I was like, wow, this is cool. So I, took a chance on her, and now she's amazing at the job, and she's been in it for like 4 or 5 years. I'm not in that company anymore, but I hear great things about her. So,
Right.
I think for me, those things are really important if you're starting out in your career. And hopefully that's a story that's enlightening for others who are thinking about it too.
No, I think that we talk about career changing a lot in this podcast, and
Yeah.
we talk about how you need to advocate yourself and also that you need to understand how different skills can be applied in different ways. And so
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's a perfect story to say you need to be creative when you want to make these changes and
Yeah.
try to apply everything you've learned in life because it is valuable. So,
Absolutely. And I think for monitoring and evaluation, a skill such as facilitation is really important, and people don't really think about that. Because, for example, you're facilitating focus group discussions or dialogue with groups of people that don't really speak to each other, or you're talking about your findings with a group of leadership team or whatever. And so you're really needing to facilitate spaces and dialogue and enable other people to unpack the findings. And so facilitation is a really key skill, but no one really talks about that. Everyone's more about, the analysis or survey design or indicator design, for example. But actually, facilitation is a really key part of monitoring and evaluation. So nuggets like that, I think, are really useful for people to understand.
Yeah, that's some great advice. Thank you so much for it. And I think my last, I wanted to discuss with you is, you have this new endeavor that I alluded to in the beginning is like you have this new podcast, and you're traveling around in a camp van doing the podcast. I don't know. Tell me more about this, everything that's going on with that.
Yeah, it's yeah, a bit different, I guess. So my podcast partner, she has a camper van, and we sort of got into this organizational transformation space because of a lot of the consultancies we've been doing. Um, we've been, obviously helping organizations in evaluations and assessments and learning. And a lot of the findings allude to organizational change. Like, how do you take these findings and change part of the organization for better? So, and her kind of skill set is strategy. So we're meeting that kind of evaluation and strategy piece. And so we were like, let's do a podcast on organizational transformation. Why not? And we did a couple of podcasts actually for a client, and that's kind of where it started. So we're huge advocates for products that are not just long reports. So as you know, in the sector, we have a tendency of writing reports that are like 50 pages long that nobody reads. And they're in English and, whatever. So we were like, okay, we need to advocate for voice notes or, slide decks that are like a video or podcasts, because people might actually listen to the findings in different mediums. And so we started doing that for a client, had some interesting conversations, and then it just kind of evolved from there. Then we were like, shall we continue this? And so she has a camper van, and we were like, well, what a great space to do this in. Bit different. It means we can actually drive to where our guests are, rock up and have them come into the van and start chatting to us. So it's a bit like a mobile studio, really. And yeah, so that's just kind of how it evolved, really. And so we're sitting a little bit now at the crux of international development and van life. I'm not sure if there's a new niche there, but we're sort of discussing that. I mean, so yeah, and we've chatted to some interesting guests already, and yeah, just in South Africa on sort of rural transformation, on a lot about race and anti-racism in the sector, diversity, inclusion. Looking at recruitment a little bit. And so we're also being a bit critical, I guess. We're not afraid to kind of throw some things out there. We read some reviews from Glassdoor. We read some crazy things about the charity sector on Twitter. So, yeah, we're throwing a little bit of fire into the space and hoping that it might inspire some people. And as you know, like the sector kind of needs a bit of a shake-up. So just throw a few extra voices in there and hope others feel the same. So yeah, the podcast is called Journey to Transformation, by the way. Just throwing that in.
Yeah, no, it's great. Journey to Transformation is a great podcast. I listened to your Glassdoor one. It was hilarious. Oh yeah, no, it was a great episode. I really enjoyed it. Brendan, my podcast partner, he hates banter, but you guys' banter is the best. He hates our banter. I should preface that. Yeah, he doesn't like it when we're like talking. I was like, "This is the show," and he's like, "I don't get it." And then he sent me your podcast episode. And he's like, "This is a great episode." I was like, "This is all banter," and he's like, "Yeah, but their banter is great." And I was like, I guess that makes sense.
Okay, well,
but it's
go on.
But it's great. No, I really appreciate this because as somebody gave me a comment a long time ago, it's like we have a rejection letter of the week. And sometimes the rejection letters come from like, I don't know, like a good organization, like a philanthropic organization. And people are thrown off as like, you're talking trash about like this organization. It's like, they're still an organization. Like they still can do things better, even if they have a good intentions with other things. So two things can be true. But yeah, no, your podcast is great. And I guess in this last question, like where can people find you if they want to find you?
Yeah, so we're on Instagram at JRNY Podcast. And you can also find our podcast, Journey to Transformation, on Spotify, on Apple, or wherever you listen to podcasts. So yeah, drop in, and we'd love some feedback, you know, even if it's negative, like you. We really welcome any feedback. Would be great. And, you know, feedback is very much a monitoring and evaluation thing as well. So I'm like, bring it to me.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Lauren. You've been an absolute pleasure.
No, thank you so much. Great.